Forget to do that. And we will start. All right, thank you everyone who is joining us now. I can see our participants coming in. Thank you for joining us in this important discussion. I want to remind everybody that some of the things we might talk about today could be difficult in nature. We're only going to be chatting for about 30 minutes, so we won't be getting into often graphic examples or anything along those lines. But just talking about trauma and talking about faith can be hard, so make sure to take care of yourself. Take breaks. We'll also have this recorded later on if you want to watch it in the future instead. And to get us started, I want to have our amazing panelists share with us a little bit about who they are. So if you wouldn't mind telling us your name, your pronouns, your role, and the organization that you are working in. So Jay, could you start us off?
Sure, Laura. Thank you. Thank you so much for including me today. Hey, Theresa, glad to see you too. I'm jkieve. I am a Baptist minister who serves a small denominational group called the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. About 1,500 or so churches, mostly in the Southeast, but spread around. And my role had been a congregational minister for 20 plus years, and then for the last decade or so serving in a denominational role that includes now abuse prevention and response. So working with churches to establish great policies and practices that protect kids and vulnerable adults, responding well to abuse in the context, or just when we learn of abuse in the abuse among our congregations and members, preventing clergy sexual abuse and other forms of misconduct. So to that end, good bit of prevention training to try to support churches, a trauma certification that I maintain just to be, helpful the most I can. So thanks for being here. I also volunteer for the agency that Theresa represents, and I'm on their board too. So I'll pass it on to you, Theresa.
Thank you, Jay. Hi, I'm Theresa Platt. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am the chaplain at Foothills Alliance, which is a sexual trauma center as well as a children's advocacy center. And we are in Anderson, South Carolina. We serve Anderson County as well as Oconee County. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. So the topic for today is a trauma-informed faith, what that means, what that potentially looks like. One of the reasons we're discussing this is because we are planning on having a larger discussion later on this month. And for anyone who is watching this, we were planning to do it in person, but now are going to switch to a virtual format because we got so many requests for that. So look for that update coming soon. But when we say trauma-informed, I think a lot of people have a million different things that come to mind, right? And even in the past 5 years, I know from working in this field, there has been a lot of pushback, right? People might say, oh, this goes too far, or this hurts more than it helps. Its intention doesn't match its impact. So I think it's really important that we start off with saying what trauma-informed care means to us and how it applies to our work. I know for myself, the 3 things I always say when people ask me to define trauma-informed care is that number 1, it's understanding the depth and breadth of trauma in the world around us. Secondly, it's changing the lens that we operate from to see every single person as a potential survivor. And third, it is switching again in our mind from saying, why are people like this? To I wonder what happened, right? Being curious internally about the story behind maybe certain responses or attitudes that we observe in them. So Theresa, I would love to know what does trauma-informed care mean to you, and how does it intersect with your work?
Right. Well, I love the phrase that you use, like what happened to you instead of why are you like that? I think that's a good reframe for all of us to use. I would say within my work, being trauma informed means that number one, that you're believing survivors and you're not questioning their story or um, making them feel like they are somehow lesser because of their story. Talking about being trauma informed within a faith community to me means that you are willing to not only embrace survivors, but also be open to the idea that your faith community could be harming survivors in the way that they engage survivors. And so being trauma informed means not just opening your doors to survivors, but also being willing to have hard conversations with survivors and listen to what they have to say and take a stance of that we're all learning. I'm learning. I'm not arriving anywhere and saying that I've learned everything about whatever the topic is. That's just such a ludicrous idea. But to have the idea that we are all students and we're learning from each other, and particularly in the field of trauma, that if you are listening to a survivor, you're not in any shape or form somehow more knowledgeable about their trauma than they are, but always feel that they are the person who knows most about their story and that you can provide support for them by listening and believing.
Thank you so much for that. Jay, what would you say trauma-informed care means to you, and how does it impact your work?
Well, it means all of those things that y'all had mentioned for sure, especially the listening and especially the wondering, what in this person's experience has, led them to this behavior or expression or, kind of how they are in the world. I wish I had known that much earlier as a minister. I think I would have been better at pastoral care and pastoral interactions. I can tell stories about that later on if we want to, but for me, in addition to all of those things, part of what being trauma informed means as a minister and as a Christian minister is theological too, because of the incarnation, the belief that Jesus in human form embodies God, blesses all of the human experience, and connects it all to the human body. And so part of being a trauma informed for me means understanding how trauma response forms in brain, body, and emotion, and honoring that as a part of creation, and understanding how some of the ways that our body and brain act to protect us, in moments of danger is something to be celebrated, even if it leads over time to harder or less helpful experiences, or ones that are bewildering to people who care for one another. It opens us up to that curiosity. It grounds it in an important part of our faith expression. And, for me, opens up so many more avenues for understanding and support and conversation and listening. And yeah, so I would add to, the things that y'all said, just that sort of embodiment, incarnational nature of being trauma informed.
I love both of those answers. Thank you so much for sharing them. And I think in both of those responses, you brought up some really important points about maybe things we don't see, things we may not have on our radar as people who are in a faith leadership role, as to how religion and spirituality and the organizations behind those things can be very triggering, can be very painful for many people who've survived all different types of interpersonal violence. I think a lot of folks would say, but I have really good intentions, right? Like, no, if someone came to me and said something terrible happened to them, of course I would be there for them. Of course I would be supportive. And I have some great things for them to read or some verses I would pull out, right? but they might not have the perspective of, again, all of the different things that can really bring up trauma and re-victimize and re-traumatize folks. So I'm curious, Jay, if you can kind of expand on that a little bit. You talked about maybe some missteps you had early on when you didn't know all that you know now. Can you explain to us a little bit of that?
Yes. So, most ministers have a church member or person in their sphere who, is probably an adversary in some way, or just a thorn in their flesh. The woman who comes to mind for me was somebody who would do a nice thing in the meanest possible way. Like everything came with a barb. She told me one day as she was going out the door, that was the best sermon you could preach, which at first sounds like a compliment, but then when you think about it a second, it's really not. And so what I later learned was that she had a very early trauma. Her husband, as a newlywed, died in a boating accident, and it transformed her life. And if I had known to ask, not what's wrong with her that she's so mean to me, but what happened in her life that created this pattern of behavior, to try to protect her from the obvious pain that comes from intimacy and from, developing close ties. I mean, I'm not a therapist, but I would have had the opportunity just to say, I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm here for you. And grief is hard and terrible, but not knowing to move in that direction really limited. And, so she as difficult as she was at times, she's somebody who for me is really the invitation to trauma-informed ministry. So I have my heart is softer toward her for those reasons. And, the other thing is, for goodness sake, if nobody ever says again, everything happens for a reason, then, if we can put the lid on that one, maybe we could take a few steps toward doing better with folks in our settings. But yeah, Theresa, add to that for sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I laughed at your story. That was a really funny example that you gave. For myself, I before doing this work, I did work in youth ministry in paid and unpaid positions. But I think that, and maybe this is anecdotal, this is just the way that I experienced the way you're supposed to do ministry and engage in the world, was if anybody had anything really terrible happen, that there was this push to explain why that happened or give some type of a reason why that happened. And at the very end of it, there's some, meaning or whatever that God had for you in that. And I think it's really sad to me to think that I also pushed that message to other people, and that, if something horrible has happened to you, that was God teaching you something. To me, that really breaks my heart to think about. And I think it wasn't until I started doing the work of a chaplain, or even before I even got to that point, that I evaluated enough trauma within my own life. And then also was looking at some of the things I was saying that I thought, I can't believe this narrative anymore, and saw it something else that was different than that. And I don't want to say that every church does that or every faith group does that the way that I did, because I don't think that's fair. But I see that happening now, that there is a push to spread that message a little bit. And, if anything, I wish I could apologize to people that I said that to, or that I pushed that narrative with, because I don't believe that anymore. And I also think that trauma is something that you had said earlier, Dr. Laura, that it's something that's very deep, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it's such a widespread thing. And I think that there's so much mystery in the world, and there's so much that we just don't understand, that I am curious why as humans, we feel this need to explain trauma very quickly to people. And, I think because it makes us feel better in our shallow theology, but I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but that was instantly what came to mind listening to Jay.
Well, and as you were saying that, Theresa, I was thinking next week in the Protestant, Catholic, Western Christian tradition is Holy Week.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll have a narrative of violence
Mm-hmm.
that will sort of spin out through the week that culminates in Good Friday and crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a couple of ways that you can approach that scripture. I mean, many, but there are lots of traditions that approach it as redemptive violence. And, it is in the violence that something is accomplished for humanity. And, I understand the theology and history of that, but from a more trauma-informed perspective, there's also the invitation there to sort of reframe, and to have God responding to this violence with life and love as opposed to causing it, and separating it from redemption, so that we're not sending the message to survivors of all sorts of violence that, this is accomplishing something for somebody else at their expense. I mean, that seems terrible to me.
Right. Well, and I think that I've heard the quote, like, God gives his toughest battles to his toughest warriors. And I just rally against that statement so much. And especially working within child advocacy, I think that sometimes it's such a naive statement because, what 3-year-old is a tough warrior? Like, that's not fair. That's a really unfair statement. But I mean, yeah, I really appreciate what you said, Jay. Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and you both bring up such a good point. And when I do trauma-informed certifications and trainings for all different industries, one of the most popular things that we talk about are things to say and things not to say. And I think spiritual spaces are just, and it doesn't matter what kind of spiritual space, they're just ripe with things that are really victim blaming, right? And further perpetuate, right? Oh, you're this brave person that God picked, or God doesn't give you anything you can't handle. Don't have a victim spirit, right? Just get over it. There's so much, right? We could do 45 minutes of just a list of things we've heard. And Jay, your note on atonement theories, I recently published an article for Pathos on that, and reframing that, and was Christ a victim or a sacrifice or a survivor, right? And I think for so many people who are hearing this, they might say, number one, what? I'm supposed to rethink these things? That how are those things harmful? Or even like, I'm in seminary right now, and then I'm hoping to go on to rabbinical school afterwards. Seminary students, rabbinical students, all different kinds of students who are emerging faith leaders might be like, I'm not hearing anything counter to this, even in my schooling currently, right? These messages are still being perpetuated and taught to us, so that when you get into those roles, that's all we have to pull from. So I'm curious about whether it's mentoring someone who's been in the field for a long time and is maybe a little confused or overwhelmed about why they would need to change what those things are saying, or someone who is just getting into these roles and might say, what am I supposed to do differently? How am I supposed to learn the things you're talking about? What would you suggest that they start by doing? Theresa, could you share your thoughts first?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think that in some ways, like, I'm still asking myself that question. But I would say a good place to start is where I started, not to be self-centered, but reading a lot of literature about it, because you don't want to be somebody who's forcing somebody else to teach you and using their place of like hurts to do that. one of the books I would suggest is Know My Name. It's a really good memoir. And another one I would use is Trauma and Recovery. That's another really good book. And that one covers not just sexual abuse, but also like genocide, as well as like torture. It's one of the first books that I read when I started working in this field. And it's not an easy read in the sense that like a lot of it, what you read is hard to process, but I would start with reading literature, and I would also start with coming from a place of humility and reshaping your own attitude of how you're going about your own work. And I'm a big believer that we always should have like lifelong learning as our motto for most things in life, and whether that's like within your field of like your job, but I also think that should be just like across the board, that like we're constantly should be learning something, and not in the sense of that like we're feeding this need, but instead of like, how do I be a better person and how do I love others well? And I think that comes from a place of humility and not coming from a place of I'm an expert. But I also think that I feel like I went on a rabbit trail on that, but I think that if you are starting any type of work that you are working directly with people, I think you just have to assume that most of the people you're working with are going to have some form of trauma. And so you really need to know your literature, but also have an attitude of I'm a student and I'm still learning and I'm not an expert. And some of the things that people tell me are not going to make any sense, and that's cool. Like that's totally fine. That doesn't make sense to me. And this is very different than my worldview. And I think that if you come from that, from a place of like very, very genuine and authentic, I think people can recognize that. And so I feel that we could all try to do that a little bit better. No. But thank you. That's a really good question.
Yeah, that's an amazing answer, Theresa. What happened to me was I met people who were serving in sexual trauma space, and their passion was compelling enough for me to start learning, like Theresa was saying, to start reading and asking questions and pursuing. And so because that was my experience, not to be self-centered like Theresa said, because that was my experience, what I recommend to almost every minister I talk to is, hey, go meet the people at the Rape Crisis Center in your community. You have one. Learn what they do, invite them to come for a training, do a little bit of learning. And the other thing that I often recommend to ministers is just Google the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, because that's a fairly low threshold entry into starting to form a trauma lens, because it's so robust, so compelling. It may be a little too simplistic, but it's easy to see the impact of trauma in the lives of people because of the way the study is, described. And so that's a little lower threshold for entry than like immediately jumping to talking about, sexual abuse or interpersonal violence or, DV or anything like that. And so those are kind of the ways that I tend to invite people to start considering a trauma-informed ministry.
Those are great resources. A book I would strongly recommend is called God Can't by Thomas J. Ord. That's one of my favorite reframes for the theological piece on this. And yes, ACE study, polyvagal. I mean, there's so many good ones that, like you said, there's a lot of resources that are very introductory. You don't have to be a social scientist to understand, but you can make that connection. You can say, oh, wow, yeah, this really is leaving this deep impact on people's lives in all the ways that they navigate the world, much less the way that they're showing up to faith spaces and interacting with leadership there. The last question I want to touch on in our time together today, before we have our closing thoughts and kind of share how people can further get in touch with either of you or this program, is we talk so much about the individual's experience, but I also want to talk about communal trauma and a little bit of the historical pieces that, again, faith spaces often carry with them. If somebody is negatively impacted, harmed in a faith environment, then the entire community is impacted. Much less historically, we look at hundreds of years of history. We know from epigenetics that that history is still very much embedded in my body, in all of our bodies. And so for myself, I know that this was a big thing that my first year in seminary really shifted for me, was looking at my family's spiritual historical trauma and going on this journey of returning to Judaism because of that, and understanding how the Inquisition had impacted them for so long. So I'm curious, is this something you have brought up to your congregations? Is this something you've explored in yourselves? And do you think these kinds of conversations should be more ongoing when we talk about trauma-informed faith? So Jay?
Yeah, for sure. I'll just glance it over if I can get this. I can reach this. One of the books that was so helpful for me to understand that is Resma Menachem's My Grandmother's Hands. Where he talked about the racialized trauma and how it has impacted generations of Black people in the United States, but also white people in the United States, and then also people who become police in the United States. And so it's a fascinating, it's a fascinating trauma perspective on those experiences, which I cannot recommend this enough. I tell people all the time, read this book. And so, yes, and it's particularly important, I think, for congregations, ministries that have any kind of sort of mission interest or mission component, to take into consideration how the histories of the communities they seek to serve can inform how they reach out, right? Like my own small faith community, the Cooperative Baptists, is really interested in listening to communities and trying to come alongside rather than to, kind of tell them what to do. But there's an invitation there to investigate, to be curious, that sort of compassionate curiosity that listens first, like Theresa was saying, and so understanding that just a faith community showing up in someone else's space can itself be triggering and can itself, sort of violate the boundaries that have been so often violated historically, right? And so for even people in those communities who haven't experienced the particular expression of that, they hold the memory of that in body and culture, in lots of ways so I do think that there's a responsibility as we move toward folks to be curious about their histories and how practices in community have developed over time. And so it's very complicated. It's very abstract for a lot of folks. We don't have adequate metaphors, I think, really to describe, in settings, congregational settings, ministry settings, how to account for that, right? So it's a difficult conversation to impart, but Theresa, you probably have a better idea than that.
Well, I think thinking about your question, that my brain goes in two different directions, because on the one hand, I think about how different religions have erased the cultures of other peoples. other conquered peoples. And that's happened, I mean, since the beginning of time, really. And so, and how tragic that is that that has happened to people. And in a lot of ways, we're still doing that. I mean, I don't want to say to a lesser extent, but that like kind of happens still. But the other thought that I have is how people who are very traumatized by either somebody who is in a position of faith leadership within their community, and how when that person comes forward to say what has happened to them, that faith community tends to protect the perpetrator and to banish the person who was harmed. And so the person that is harmed then loses their faith community. Frequently, they lose their belief. And they also are then like ostracized from most of the people who were at one point in time their spiritual caretakers, and sometimes their family and friends, like, because that tends to be what I see. And so I think I'll probably spend more time in that camp because I know less about the historical, but I think that for faith communities to, one, have good policies for how to handle those types of scenarios. Whenever somebody comes in and says that they were assaulted by somebody who's in faith leadership, I think that's important to have some type of policy, and that you know what that policy is, and that policy is still relevant. But aside from that, I also think that if churches are willing to show up for survivors of abuse, and whether that means that they go to court hearings and sit on the side of the survivor, or if that means simply having a pastor or lay leader or somebody just to simply say, like, I believe you and you matter. And also that, however frequently that you are going through scripture in the Bible and you're reading stories of violence, that the person is willing to say, like, this is a story of violence, and also do a good job of talking theologically through that to demonstrate that they do not blame survivors.
And I think all those things that you mentioned are things people are so hungry for, right? They would love to know that they can go into a space and talk about spirituality and talk about their connection to God and be believed and be heard. And yeah, have discussions about, this is going to be difficult. Let's talk about the nuance around this. Let's talk about how this story has been told so many times, but can be really, really painful and has some really dark elements to it. I think that is so rare and it needs to be more common, but that's what more and more people are going to be searching for. So this has been an amazing discussion. We really could go on so much longer, and we will, because we will be meeting, like I said, at the end of the month. We have now a virtual summit where we'll be discussing a lot more of these topics. We'll have another panel. I'll be giving a lot of lectures on where research is telling us to go, how to apply that theologically, and that will be very interactive so that folks can really take things away, bring it back to their communities, and start implementing ideas. But if people want to just reach out to either of you, know more about you, how can they get in touch? Theresa?
I am about to type my email into the chat, so everybody has that. But also, the organization I work for is Foothills Alliance. And so if you go there, we try to keep it up to date, but I will also put my email in there. And I would love to hear from anybody who would like to talk further about this.
Yeah, same. I put my email in the chat. Love to hear from you if you have questions or want to follow up.
Awesome. And all that information will also be available when we post this on YouTube in the description, as well as details to the event. Thank you. Thank you so much for both being here and engaging in what is often a difficult topic, but a topic that you have both committed your lives to. That means so much to so many people, including myself. If anyone has further questions, again, feel free to get in touch with the National Center for Equity Agency or either of our amazing panelists. We thank you for joining us today. Take care.